In the entire recorded history of human evolution, there had never been an alpha classified as 3S until he appeared, and from that moment forward the system that had governed strength, hierarchy, and control for generations quietly broke under the weight of a single existence. Because the alpha scale had always ended at S+, a ceiling accepted by both science and military doctrine as absolute, the highest measurable limit of biological dominance. Yet on the day Valenkryos was first evaluated, the instruments did not confirm a result. They failed, not once but 3 times in succession, forcing a complete recalibration of every diagnostic system involved. And even after verification across multiple facilities, the conclusion remained unchanged. Valenkryos was an alpha beyond S+, an alpha designated as 3S, a classification that did not exist before him, a category without precedent, without data, without a method of control. He was not at the top of the system, he existed outside of it entirely. And in the beginning that anomaly was celebrated, he was hailed as the ultimate asset, a living weapon, a symbol of unmatched power. His rise through the ranks was immediate and unstoppable, from frontline officer to strategic commander, and eventually the youngest general in Federation history. His campaigns ended conflicts faster than projections predicted. His presence alone shifted outcomes before engagements even began. He did not hesitate, he did not retreat, and he never required protection. But the same force that made him indispensable also carried a cost no one had anticipated. Because Valenkryos's pheromones did not behave like those of any known alpha, they did not simply dominate, they penetrated, they accumulated, slow and silent, building pressure beneath the surface like a sealed system approaching its limit, invisible until the moment it became impossible to ignore. And during early containment incidents, entire sections of secured facilities had to be evacuated. Even high-tier Omegas trained for extreme exposure could not remain conscious for more than a few minutes in close proximity, and although the medical division responded immediately by initiating a specialized suppression program, adapting every known inhibitor formula and increasing dosage thresholds beyond standard limits, the results were consistently insufficient, not because the compounds were ineffective, but because none of them had ever been designed for a 3S alpha. His physiology did not respond within expected parameters. The suppression failed to stabilize, and over time his body began to resist even the strongest formulations available, leaving only one theoretical solution that researchers could not ignore: a compatible Omega capable of balancing his pheromonal output. But after hundreds of compatibility trials across every classification tier, the final report was clear and absolute. No suitable Omega existed. He was the highest expression of his kind, and at the same time entirely without a counterpart. And as the weeks passed, the imbalance began to manifest physically, first as persistent insomnia, then as constant pressure behind the eyes, followed by sudden waves of heat and accelerated heart rate that originated deep within his chest and spread outward. And eventually there were moments when he could hear something that was not external, a rising internal noise that pressed against his thoughts, urging movement, urging release, urging something he could not fully define. And the medical team gave it a name: endogenous pheromone storm. A state that once triggered would result in total loss of cognitive control, no confirmed method of containment, no reliable way to intervene. And although no one spoke the conclusion aloud in his presence, it was understood across every level of command that if that threshold was crossed, Valenkryos would no longer be a protector of the Federation, but its greatest internal risk. And when the final report reached him, it contained only a single line: stabilization impossible, long-term isolation recommended, a sterile phrase that carried the weight of permanent confinement. He closed the report without comment, without visible reaction. But that same night a military vessel departed orbit without authorization, no transmission, no escort, no attempt to conceal its trajectory, and no one moved to stop it. Because no one believed they could. The destination was manually set to a low-priority celestial body beyond active routes, Scrap Planet K-27, a world long abandoned, no cities, no infrastructure, no recognized life. Only endless fields of fractured metal and the remains of dismantled ships scattered across miles of barren terrain, structures collapsed under time and neglect. The wind carrying fine metallic dust through open space, producing a constant hollow sound that echoed across the surface. Yet K-27 was not entirely dead. Beneath the layers of corrosion and debris existed a primitive microbial system that sustained minimal atmospheric viability. Oxygen levels barely measurable but present, water sources contaminated but not entirely unusable, temperatures unstable but survivable under certain conditions. A place where standard human physiology would fail within hours, unless that physiology deviated from the norm. At the edge of one of these fields stood a small structure, assembled from salvaged fragments, reinforced just enough to endure the environment. And within it lived an Omega, no records, no origin, no official designation, only a quiet existence maintained against conditions that should have made survival impossible. And at the same time Valen Cryos' vessel descended through the thin atmosphere and settled onto the surface without ceremony, he stepped out alone. And within seconds the pressure inside his body surged beyond expectation, his vision narrowed, his breathing became uneven, the internal storm rising faster than projected. He forced himself forward, one step, then another, but the strength in his body failed to respond. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt, the weight inside his head intensifying until it drowned out everything else. And then the last of his balance gave out and Valen Cryos collapsed onto the cold metal-strewn ground. And in the final fragment of awareness before darkness overtook him, he saw a figure in the distance, small, unmoving, watching. Danger registered instinctively. A warning formed in his mind. Do not come closer. But his throat would not respond. No sound followed the command. His vision dimmed completely, and his consciousness slipped away before a single word could be spoken. He woke to warmth before he understood where he was, a thin kind of warmth that didn't belong to a military base or a sealed chamber, something softer, uneven, real, and for a moment his body did not react the way it always did. No surge, no crushing pressure, just a quiet stillness that felt unfamiliar, and that alone made him open his eyes. The ceiling above him was patched together from mismatched panels, metal and translucent sheets that let dim gray light pass through, unregulated and imperfect, which meant he was nowhere the Federation would approve. Memory returned in fragments. K-27, the descent, the collapse, the storm building too fast, and then that figure, small, distant, watching. He pushed himself up sharply, instinct taking over before reason. His hand moved first, catching a wrist, soft, too soft, fragile under his grip. The person in front of him gasped without sound, body tensing as they tried to pull away, and that was when he saw him clearly, a small Omega, thin shoulders, worn clothes clinging with dust, eyes wide with fear, not defiance, not calculation, just instinctive fear. The Omega tried to speak, but no words came out, only a breath that broke in silence. And Valen understood immediately. He couldn't speak. The realization landed quickly, and he released him at once, stepping back just enough to create space. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and rough but steady. The Omega shook his head quickly, hands trembling as he tried to explain something without sound, then stopped, as if he already knew it would not matter. Valen watched him closely, searching for threat, for intent, for anything that did not belong. But there was nothing there, only fear and hesitation. And then he noticed something else, something far more important, the absence of pressure. His chest felt lighter, his thoughts clearer. The storm that had been rising inside him had not disappeared, but it had receded, noticeably, unnaturally, and that alone was enough to sharpen his focus. He drew in a slow breath, forcing control into his movements. "Stay back," he said, quieter now, not a command, but a warning, because he still did not trust what was happening. The Omega nodded immediately, stepping away toward the door, ready to leave if needed. And for a moment Valen almost let him go, because that would have been safer for both of them. But as the distance increased, the pressure inside him shifted again, subtle but undeniable, heavier the farther the Omega moved, lighter when he paused, and that was enough. "Wait," Valen said, and the Omega stopped instantly, turning back with uncertainty written across his face. Valen studied him again, properly this time, taking in the details he had ignored before, the soft fall of hair across his forehead despite the dust, the pale skin beneath the grime, the faint marks on his wrist where Valen had gripped too hard, thin and fragile. Something in Valen's chest tightened, unfamiliar and unwelcome. and he stepped forward slowly, controlled, reaching into his jacket instead of toward the Omega, pulling out a small medical pack. He did not ask. He simply took the Omega's wrist again, more carefully this time, applying treatment with practiced precision. The Omega flinched but did not pull away, watching him with confusion, as if he did not understand why this was happening. And then a soft sound broke the silence. The Omega froze, head lowering immediately in embarrassment as his stomach betrayed him. Valen said nothing. He only reached into his pack again and took out a compact ration bar, offering it without ceremony. The Omega hesitated, eyes flicking between the food and Valen's face, as if confirming it was truly meant for him. And when Valen did not withdraw it, he accepted it carefully, holding it with both hands, breaking it into small pieces instead of eating it all at once, each bite measured, controlled, like someone who had learned to survive on very little. Valen watched him in silence, and for the first time in a long time a thought formed that he had not allowed himself before. Maybe the system had not failed completely. Maybe it had simply been looking in the wrong place. He shifted his hand, palm open in front of the Omega. "Can you write?" he asked. The Omega blinked, then nodded, hesitant but certain. "Your name," Valen said, and the Omega looked at his hand like he was unsure he was allowed to touch it, before slowly lifting a finger and tracing letters against his skin. "Light, almost weightless, Eryn." Valen repeated the name silently, fixing it in his memory. Aaron. It suited him in a way that felt strangely precise, soft but present, fragile but enduring. Valen let his hand lower after a moment, the silence between them shifting into something less sharp, less guarded, and he knew he did not have time to pretend this was temporary, not with what was happening inside him, not with how quickly it could escalate again. So he spoke plainly, directly. "Come with me." The Omega's head lifted at once, surprise clear even without words. "I can take you somewhere safe," Valen continued, his tone steady, controlled. "Clean air, stable shelter, regular food." He paused briefly, then added the only thing that seemed to matter when he looked at him. "No one will hurt you." The Omega did not respond immediately. He only looked at Valen, searching, uncertain, as if weighing something far beyond the words themselves. Valen did not move closer, did not press. He simply waited, and after a long moment the Omega lowered his gaze, fingers tightening slightly around the remaining food, before slowly, carefully, he nodded. The return flight was quieter than anything Valen Cryos had experienced in years, not because the ship lacked sound, but because for the first time his own body was not fighting against it. The constant pressure that had once built inside his chest like a storm was reduced to something distant, controlled, almost unreal, and he remained seated near the central console, posture steady, gaze fixed forward, while a short distance away Aaron sat carefully at the edge of his seat, hands clasped tightly, shoulders slightly drawn inward as if trying to make himself smaller. His eyes moved slowly across the interior of the ship, absorbing every detail with quiet caution, every shift in light, every mechanical hum, every movement that did not belong to the world he knew. And each time the sound changed, even slightly, his body would tense before easing. Again, and yet whenever Valen spoke, even a single word, that tension faded almost immediately. The space between them remained small, not because it was required, but because neither of them seemed willing to widen it. As if distance itself carried weight neither wanted to test. Valen noticed the pattern without acknowledging it, storing it the same way he did battlefield variables, precise, useful, undeniable. When the ship reached stable orbit, he initiated a direct line to Central Command. His voice returned to its usual tone, calm, measured, controlled, leaving no trace of the instability that had driven him off-grid. He confirmed his status, alive, operational, issued a directive to contain any information regarding his absence. And although the officers on the other end attempted to maintain protocol, the pause in their responses gave them away. Relief layered over tension, questions they did not dare ask. Valen ended the transmission without elaboration, whatever had happened. On K-27 was not something he intended to share yet, especially not until he understood it himself. The descent into headquarters was immediate and precise. Controlled air pressure, stabilized gravity, polished corridors reflecting clean white light, everything structured, everything predictable, and in that environment Aaron's presence stood out even more. He walked beside Valen with quiet steps, close but careful, eyes lowered more often now, overwhelmed by the scale of everything around him. And when personnel passed, they slowed without meaning to, attention drawn not only to Valen but to the unfamiliar figure at his side. Something about him made people look twice without understanding why. Once inside a secured corridor, Valen stopped and turned slightly toward him, his expression unchanged but his voice lowered just enough to shift its weight. "You'll stay here for a while," he said, steady and clear. "No one will hurt you." Eren looked up immediately, searching his face as if measuring truth rather than listening to words. Valen held his gaze without hesitation. "I'll come back," he added, and for a brief second Eren's hand lifted, fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of Valen's sleeve, not enough to hold him there, just enough to confirm he was real before letting go. Valen gave a single nod and signaled for staff, issuing direct instructions for care, clean clothing, food, basic medical attention, nothing excessive but nothing neglected. And then he turned and walked away without looking back. The medical division was already prepared. The examination began immediately. Full-spectrum scans, pheromone density, neurological stability, hormonal regulation, data streamed across the displays in rapid succession. And with each update, the room grew quieter, because the numbers did not align with expectation. The accumulated pheromone levels that had been approaching critical thresholds were now significantly reduced, not temporarily suppressed, but consistently lower across every metric. One of the senior physicians recalibrated the system, ran the analysis again, then again. The result did not change. This level of stabilization isn't possible without a compatible Omega, he said under his breath, more to the data than to Valen. Valen stood still, eyes fixed on the readings. "It changed after contact," he said, voice even, recounting the encounter on K-27 with precise detail, no speculation, only fact. The physician turned slowly, expression sharpening as realization began to form. "Then we examine him," he said, and the focus of the entire room shifted. Eren was brought in not long after, and for a moment the controlled rhythm of the medical wing broke, because the person who entered no longer matched the image stored in their memory, cleaned, dressed, no longer hidden beneath dust and worn fabric. His features were clear, his hair falling softly into place, his skin pale but luminous under sterile light, his eyes bright, reflective, and there was a brief, unspoken pause as several people simply looked, not out of protocol, not out of analysis, but because they could not look away. Eren noticed the attention immediately and instinctively moved closer to Valen, positioning himself slightly behind him, his presence quiet but seeking, as if Valen was the only fixed point in a space that felt too large. Valen did not move away, did not correct the distance. The examination began, scanners adjusted for Omega classification, readings collected, processed, flagged, and then flagged again. The data did not stabilize. Some results suggested a low-level Omega with minimal output. Others returned irregular patterns that could not be categorized within known parameters. The lead technician frowned, adjusting calibration, deepening the scan. The inconsistency remained. "This doesn't match anything," someone said quietly. Another voice followed. "There's nothing here that explains the effect on him." Valen's gaze shifted briefly from the display to Eren, who stood still, silent, hands loosely clasped, eyes lowered but alert, aware of everything around him. And his voice. The physician continued, reviewing additional data. "There's no structural issue, nothing congenital." He looked back at Valen. He wasn't born unable to speak. The room stilled for a fraction of a second, not because of the statement itself, but because of what it suggested. Something had been altered, something had been hidden, something they were not seeing. At that exact moment, a secondary monitor updated, drawing attention back to Valen's own readings. The numbers had shifted again, slightly higher than before, not dangerous, not yet, but rising, and the only variable that had changed was distance. Eren had taken a single step back during the scan, barely noticeable, but enough. Valen's eyes sharpened immediately. "Bring him closer," he said. The instruction came without hesitation. Eren stepped forward, uncertain but compliant, and within seconds the readings adjusted again, dropping, stabilizing. The room went completely silent this time. No one spoke, no one moved, because the pattern was no longer theoretical. It was measurable, undeniable. One of the physicians finally exhaled slowly, voice lower than before. He shouldn't be able to stabilize you. Valen did not look away from the screen, his answer. Immediate, absolute. But he does. And in that moment, every assumption they had relied on shifted, because whatever Aaron was, it was not something the system had failed to find. It was something the system had never learned how to recognize, and that was exactly what made him dangerous. They did not separate him from Valen Cryos, not after what the data had shown. The arrangement was presented as controlled observation, a temporary measure to monitor stability, but in practice it placed Aaron inside Valen's private quarters, the only environment where the readings had remained consistently within safe limits. The space was vast, structured, built for precision rather than comfort. Yet the moment Aaron stepped inside, subtle changes followed. The lighting dimmed slightly, the temperature adjusted by a fraction, details so small they would go unnoticed by most, but not by Valen. And he did not reverse them. Aaron paused just beyond the entrance at first, uncertain, taking in the scale of the room, the quiet order, the absence of decay. So different from everything he had known, he did not move until Valen did. And then he followed, maintaining a careful distance that never truly became distance. Meals arrived at regular intervals, untouched by scarcity, and Aaron approached them with the same habits he had formed on K27, breaking portions into smaller pieces, stretching each bite as if it might be his last. Valen observed in silence for a moment before speaking, his voice even, controlled. "You don't have to do that here." Aaron's hands paused mid-motion, his gaze lifting slowly, searching Valen's expression as if trying to understand whether the statement could be trusted. He nodded after a moment, but his movements did not change. Habit held stronger. Then reassurance. Valen did not repeat himself. Some things could not be undone in a single sentence. The first night settled into a quiet tension neither acknowledged. Aaron lay at a distance, eyes open long after the lights dimmed, the silence unfamiliar, the safety even more so, while Valen remained awake as well, not because of the storm that had once defined him, but because of its absence, something inside him waiting, measuring, until finally he spoke into the darkness. "Stay here." The words were simple, direct, not raised but impossible to ignore. Aaron hesitated only briefly before moving, crossing the distance. Slowly, stopping just within reach, not touching, just close enough. And that was enough. His breathing steadied first, then his eyes closed, sleep taking him quickly, deeper than anything he had known in years, and Valen followed soon after, his own rest uninterrupted for the first time in longer than he could remember. Morning came without strain, without pressure, without the weight that had once been constant. And that alone confirmed what the data had suggested. This was not temporary. The routine that followed formed without instruction. Aaron remained close, moving when Valen moved, stopping when he stopped, observing everything with quiet attention, and Valen allowed it, adjusting his pace without comment, because each time Aaron drifted too far, even by a step or two, there was a shift, subtle but precise, a faint return of pressure, nothing critical, but enough to matter, enough to confirm the pattern. It did not go unnoticed, not by Valen, and not by the systems that continued to track his condition in silence. Eventually, when stability became the new baseline rather than an anomaly, Valen turned his attention to understanding. He waited until Aaron was settled, until the tension in his posture had eased. Then he spoke, his tone lower than command. "Where did you come from?" Aaron looked up immediately, the question catching him off guard. His lips parted, then closed again. Hesitation clear. Valen did not press, did not repeat. He simply waited, and that alone changed something. Aaron swallowed, forcing his voice through a throat and used a sound. I. The word broke, uneven, and he flinched, eyes lowering, but Valen did not react. "It's fine," he said calmly. "Take your time." The words held no pressure, only space, and Aaron tried again, slower, more deliberate. Aaron," he said, voice rough but present. Valen gave a slight nod. "Again," he said, and Aaron repeated it, clearer this time. Then again, each attempt steadier than the last. Something in his expression shifted with each success, tension easing, replaced by something quieter, more certain. Valen continued, guiding without forcing. "Where?" he asked, breaking the question into something smaller. "Did you stay?" Aaron understood. K. 27, he answered. Alone, he added after a pause. Valen noted the answer without comment. How long? He asked. Aaron shook his head, unable to measure time in numbers. Long, he said softly. Valen accepted it. And your voice, he continued. What happened? Aaron hesitated longer this time, something guarded flickering across his face. No talk. Long time, he said, searching for the words. Hard, speak. Valen understood. The isolation, the environment, the absence of interaction. None of it required further explanation. Then we fix it, he said simply, the certainty in his voice leaving no room for doubt. Aaron looked at him, something shifting in his eyes, and for the first time he spoke without being asked, slow but clear. Valen. The name was uneven, fragile, but unmistakable, and Valen stilled for a fraction of a second, not outwardly, but enough to register. Then he nodded once, accepting it as if it were expected, though nothing about it was. The days that followed settled into a pattern of quiet repetition, simple words, short phrases, gradual progress. Aaron's voice remained soft but grew steadier, hesitation fading, replaced by a fragile confidence. And with each step forward his movements changed as well. He stayed close without thinking, no longer standing behind Valen but beside him, his presence no longer tentative, but chosen, and Valen did not correct it, because the effect remained constant. The closer Aaron was, the more stable everything inside him became. For the first time, stability did not feel temporary. It felt sustainable, and somewhere far beyond the controlled silence of Valen's quarters. In a chamber where decisions were made without hesitation, a report was reviewed, the change. In Valen Cryos's condition, the anomaly in the data, the presence of an unidentified omega, silence followed, brief, deliberate. He was supposed to decline. One voice said quietly, another responded. Then something interfered, and a third voice, colder, more decisive, concluded, secure it. And with that single word the situation changed, because whatever had stabilized Valen Cryos was no longer something to observe, it was something to take. The change was not enough. That was the conclusion the medical division reached after days of continuous monitoring. The numbers were stable, significantly improved, but not safe. Not yet. And Valen Cryos did not tolerate uncertainty when it came to something that could turn him into a threat again. He stood in silence as the lead physician brought up the results, projections hovering in the air between them. Proximity works, the doctor said carefully, but only to a limited degree. Valen did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the data, steady, unreadable. You're stable now, the doctor continued, but not permanently. If something disrupts the balance, you could relapse. Valen's expression did not change. Then we eliminate the variables, he said, his voice calm, decisive. The doctor hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing. There is a way to push your condition into a safe range, he said, but it requires a deeper connection. Valen's gaze shifted. Slightly, just enough to acknowledge the implication. Explain, he said. The doctor did not soften it. Biological bonding, he said directly. Fluid exchange, or marking. A confirmed mate bond would stabilize your system completely. Silence followed. Brief, but heavy. Valen did not look away from the projection, but something in his posture shifted, not resistance, but consideration. Then proceed, he said. But the doctor shook his head. We can't, he replied. Not without consent from both of you. That was the moment Valen finally looked up, his expression unchanged, but his answer came without hesitation. Then it doesn't happen, he said. Firm, absolute, no room for negotiation. The doctor exhaled slowly, as if expecting that answer. In that case, he continued, you'll need to remain within close range at all times. He adjusted the display, narrowing the parameters, 2 meters. He said, no farther than that. It's the only way to maintain your current stability. Valen absorbed the information in silence, then gave a short nod. The meeting ended there, efficient, clinical, but the implication remained, and for the first time, the variable had a name that mattered. When Valen returned, Aaron was exactly where he had left him, sitting near the window, quiet, watching the unfamiliar world outside with a focus that suggested he was trying to understand it rather than admire it. He turned immediately when Valen entered, his attention locking onto him without hesitation. Valen paused for a brief moment, registering the shift in his own condition, the steadying effect immediate, precise. Then he stepped closer, closing the distance deliberately. "Stay close to me," he said, his tone even, simplified. Aaron blinked, then nodded without question, no hesitation, no request for explanation, just acceptance. And that alone said more than any answer could. "It helps," Valen added after a moment. Aaron nodded again, softer this time. And from that moment forward, he did not stray, not even by accident. When Valen moved, he followed. When Valen stopped, he remained within reach, as if the boundary had been drawn not by instruction, but by instinct. Later that day, Valen brought him along during a routine inspection. The presence of an Omega at his side did not go unnoticed. Conversations paused, glances lingered, curiosity barely concealed beneath discipline. But no one spoke out of line. Not yet. Aaron stayed close, observing everything, unfamiliar but not overwhelmed, until a sudden mechanical fault broke the controlled rhythm of the environment. A piece of overhead equipment shifted. Unexpectedly, the movement sharp, unpredictable, and before anyone else could react, Valen had already moved, his hand catching Aaron and pulling him in, positioning himself between him and the falling structure. The impact never reached them, stopped mid-fall by automated systems. But the motion had already been completed. Aaron was pressed against him, his hands gripping Valen's uniform instinctively, holding on with a force that surprised even himself, and he did not let go immediately. Seconds passed, then more, his breathing uneven at first, then gradually settling. But his hold remained, and Valen did not push him away. He assumed it was fear, shock, something fragile that needed time to pass. So he allowed it, standing still, one arm steady at Aaron's back, until the tension eased on its own. Around them, the silence shifted, then broke into low, poorly concealed amusement. One of the soldiers nearby let out a quiet laugh. "Didn't know you had one of those, General," another added. "Looks like you found your Omega." The tone was light, teasing, but the implication was clear. Valen's gaze shifted toward them instantly, sharp, controlled. "Watch your words," he said, his voice calm, but carrying enough weight to silence them immediately. "And if you have time to talk," he added, "you have time to train." A few quiet groans followed, but no one argued. The matter ended there, discipline restored as quickly as it had been broken. Aaron had released him by then, though his hands lingered for a moment longer than necessary before dropping, his expression thoughtful rather than frightened now, as if something else had caught his attention. Later, when they were alone again, he spoke, slowly, carefully, each word chosen with effort. "Mate?" he asked, the word unfamiliar in his mouth, but clear. Valen paused, just slightly, the question expected, but not simple. "It means choosing someone," he said, his tone steady, measured, staying with them. Aaron listened, absorbing each word, then asked again, quieter this time. "Why me?" The question hung between them, direct, unguarded. Valen held his gaze for a moment before answering. "They were joking," he said. "It's not something decided like that." He paused briefly, then added, "It happens when both people choose it." Aaron did not respond immediately. His eyes lowered slightly, not in avoidance, but in thought, as if committing the answer to memory, and he nodded once, small, quiet, but certain, and though nothing more was said, something had already shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but real, and far beyond the controlled order of the military. In a place where power moved without restraint, the reports had reached the highest level, the anomaly confirmed, the pattern undeniable. "He's recovering," one voice said, low, displeased. Another responded, colder. "That shouldn't be happening." Silence followed. Heavy, deliberate, before the final decision was made, "Bring me the cause." And this time, there was no ambiguity, because whatever had changed Valen Cryos was no longer just a variable to monitor. It was something they intended to claim. The briefing room doors remained closed longer than usual, layers of security sealing the discussion inside as high-ranking officers reviewed projections of a potential external threat, a neighboring system shifting its fleets in ways that were not yet hostile, but far from neutral. Valen Cryos stood at the center of it all, calm, controlled, his presence alone enough to stabilize the tension in the room, while just outside, Aaron waited exactly where he had been told, close enough to maintain the distance that mattered, but far enough not to intrude. He stood quietly by the wall, hands loosely at his sides, eyes occasionally shifting toward the door as if measuring time in silence, until a light voice broke the stillness. "You must be Aaron." A young officer approached, her expression open, curious rather than guarded. Aaron turned toward her, a brief hesitation before he nodded. "You can talk," she said, a little surprised, stepping closer with interest. "I heard you couldn't." Aaron paused, then answered slowly, carefully shaping each word. "A little," his voice still soft, but far steadier than before. Her expression brightened immediately. "That's impressive," she said, lowering her voice slightly as if sharing something informal. "You know, you've already done more than anyone else has." Aaron blinked, not fully understanding, and she leaned in just a little, continuing. "The general, he's been dealing with his condition for years," she said. "No one could get close, not for long. It always got worse, not better." Aaron listened closely, his gaze focused. "But you," she added, smiling lightly. "You changed that." Aaron lowered his eyes slightly, absorbing the words, then asked slowly, "Why?" "Not safe yet." She tilted her head, considering how much to say, then answered anyway, her tone still casual but more thoughtful. "Because being near him helps, but it's not enough," she said. "It needs to be closer, stronger. Something more direct." Aaron looked up again, quiet, attentive, and she continued, almost teasing now, like staying really close, touching, holding, things like that. She paused, then added with a playful tone. "A proper bond would fix it completely." Aaron's expression did not change much, but something in his eyes sharpened slightly, as if the words had settled deeper than expected. "Then why not do it?" he asked. The question simple, direct, and she laughed softly. "Because it's not that simple," she said. "It has to be mutual. Both people have to choose it." She leaned back slightly, glancing toward the still-closed doors, then added with a grin. "Besides, you'd have to be pretty special to end up as his mate." The moment lingered for a second longer before the door behind them slid open without warning, and her entire expression changed instantly, straightening, stepping back. "I should get back to work," she said quickly, already moving away. "You didn't hear anything from me." And then she was gone, leaving Aaron alone again, but not unchanged. He stood there in silence, the words replaying in his mind. Closer, stronger, help him. The meaning simple, the decision even simpler. When Valen stepped out moments later, Aaron moved without hesitation, closing the distance again as naturally as breathing. The rest of the day passed without incident, but the thought remained, quiet, persistent, waiting, and that night, when the lights dimmed and the room settled into silence, Aaron lay still for a while, eyes open, listening, not to the room, but to Valen, the subtle shift in his breathing, the faint tension that had returned, small, but present, and after a few moments, he moved, slow, careful, crossing the space between them, climbing onto the bed without making a sound, and slipping into the space beside him, closer than before, his arms wrapping around Valen instinctively. Holding on as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Valen woke, almost immediately, not startled, but alert, his gaze shifting down toward him. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly, his voice low, controlled even in the moment. Aaron looked up at him, unafraid, his answer simple, honest. "I don't want to sleep alone," he said, the words steady despite their softness. "I like this," he added, tightening his hold slightly. "Warm, safe." He hesitated for a second, then continued, slower, more certain. "Feels like I'm alive." The words settled into the silence between them, unpolished, but real, and Valen did not respond immediately. Something in his expression shifting just slightly, not visible to most, but enough, and without another word, his arm moved, wrapping around Aaron, pulling him closer, holding him in place, firm but not restrictive, and this time, when he closed his eyes again, the tension in his body eased more completely than before, the faint strain gone, replaced by something steadier, something quieter, and Aaron felt it. The difference immediate, subtle but undeniable. His hold softened slightly, not loosening, just adjusting, as if confirming what he had already begun to understand. It works. The thought was simple, but it stayed with him as sleep finally took him, and for the first time, it was not just Valen who rested easier, but both of them, together. Valen Cryos woke before the lights shifted, before the base transitioned into morning, his body following the rigid precision it had always known. But this time something held him in place, something warm, soft, steady. His gaze lowered, and there Aaron was, still asleep, still holding on to him, as if even in rest he refused to let go, his breathing slow and even, his expression completely unguarded, the faint tension that usually lingered around him gone, replaced by something peaceful, something almost fragile. And for the first time, Valen did not move, did not disengage, he simply stayed, watching, his mind unusually quiet as it traced details he had never allowed himself to notice before. The softness of Aaron's features, the way his lashes rested against his skin, the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers curled slightly into the fabric at Valen's side, as if anchoring himself there. And an unfamiliar thought surfaced, slow but persistent. Why someone like him had been left on a place like K-27? Why no system had identified him correctly? Why someone so small, so seemingly fragile, could do what no one else in the entire empire had been able to do? Why his presence alone could quiet something that had been uncontrollable for years? The questions lingered, unanswered. But for once, Valen did not push them away, because for the first time, the uncertainty did not feel like a threat. It felt like something he wanted to understand. His gaze softened slightly, almost imperceptible, and he allowed Aaron to sleep longer than he should have, longer than his schedule would ever permit, until Aaron shifted faintly, his lashes fluttering before his eyes slowly opened, confusion flickering for a brief second before recognition settled in, and then he froze, realizing where he was. Sorry. I woke up late, he said softly, his voice still touched with sleep but steady, and Valen answered without hesitation, his tone quieter than usual. It's fine, he said, we still have time. Though beneath the words, something unspoken lingered, a quiet awareness that his time had already begun to bend around someone else. The morning unfolded differently, subtly but undeniably. Valen adjusted without acknowledging it. Meals arrived and he remained nearby, ensuring Aaron ate properly, not rushing, not retreating. When the room cooled slightly, he adjusted it before Aaron could react. When he noticed the Omega hesitate, he stepped away briefly and returned with an outer layer, placing it around Aaron's shoulders with a steady, practiced motion, his fingers brushing lightly against the fabric near Aaron's collar, lingering for a fraction longer than necessary before withdrawing, controlled, deliberate. And Aaron accepted it quietly, his fingers lightly gripping the edge as if confirming its warmth. Later, before leaving for duty, Valen placed several data tablets within reach, their displays filled with simple reading material, structured for gradual learning. For when I'm working, he said, and then, after a brief pause, added, stay close. Aaron nodded without hesitation, his gaze following Valen for a moment longer than necessary before shifting back, and throughout the day, the pattern repeated whenever the space allowed it. Whenever there was no one else present, Aaron moved closer, not by accident, not with hesitation, but with quiet intention, his arms wrapping around Valen from behind or at his side, holding him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And each time, Valen stilled, his body reacting before his mind, a subtle tightening of his hold, instinctive, immediate, before control returned, until finally, he spoke, his voice lower, more measured than before. Why do you keep doing that? Aaron looked at him, not startled, not embarrassed, only honest. I want to help, he said, the words clearer now, more certain. It works, he added softly, his grip tightening just slightly. And I like it. The simplicity of the answer left no space for deflection, no room to reframe it into something easier to manage. And for a moment, Valen said nothing. But something inside him shifted, something unfamiliar and dangerously close to losing control, not in the way he had feared before, but in a way he did not yet understand. His gaze lowered, studying Aaron for a second longer than necessary. And the thought came sharper this time. If you keep doing this, I won't be careful with you anymore. And that was what stopped him, not fear for himself, but for Aaron, for what he might become if the balance tipped too far. His hand lifted, resting lightly against Aaron's shoulder, not pushing him away, just grounding himself, anchoring the reaction before it could surface, and he exhaled slowly, regaining control without breaking the contact. But before the moment could settle, the atmosphere shifted, subtle at first. Then, unmistakable, the doors opened without announcement, and the presence that entered carried a weight that did not belong to the military. It did not need to be loud, did not need to demand attention. It simply took it. Valen's posture changed instantly, every line of his body sharpening into something precise, controlled, and colder than before, his gaze lifting toward the figures stepping inside, their uniforms marked with an insignia that did not answer to him, did not answer to the command structure he led, but to something above it, something that did not negotiate. And for the first time since Eren had stepped into his space, Valen moved without thinking, his hand shifting from Eren's shoulder to pull him slightly behind his position, a small movement, controlled, but unmistakable, a line drawn without words, because this was no longer something that could be adjusted, no longer something that could be observed from a distance. This was something that had come to take. And for the first time, Valen Cryos did not intend to let it. They did not announce themselves the way protocol required. No formal request, no prior clearance. Only the insignia on their uniforms and the quiet authority that came with it. And the room shifted the moment they stepped in, conversation ceased, attention redirected. Even the air seemed to tighten. Valen Cryos did not move from his position, did not step forward to greet them, did not yield space. He remained exactly where he stood, one hand still resting just slightly behind him where Eren stood within reach, a position that looked neutral to most, but was anything but. The leading figure inclined his head just enough to acknowledge rank without conceding it. General Cryos, his tone controlled, precise, but absent of deference. We are here under royal directive regarding the unidentified Omega under your protection. Valen's gaze remained steady, unreadable. There is nothing to report. He replied evenly, dismissive in a way that did not invite further discussion. The man did not react immediately, only lifted a hand slightly, and a projection formed between them, layers of data unfolding in silence, inconsistent readings, incomplete classification, gaps that should not exist. Your systems cannot classify him, the man said. His biological markers do not align with any registered Omega profile. Valen did not look at the projection. Then update your systems, he said, calm, final, but the man's expression sharpened just slightly. Or consider the alternative, he continued, his gaze shifting past Valen, toward where Eren stood, that he was never meant to be classified. And that was when Valen moved, not abruptly, not enough to be called aggression, but enough to step fully into the line of sight, blocking it completely, controlled, deliberate, final. He stays where he is, Valen said, and this time, there was no space left in his voice for interpretation. The man studied him for a moment, then continued, unhurried. We have reason to believe he may not be what he appears to be. The words landed quietly, but carried weight. An unregistered Omega, found in an abandoned sector, capable of altering the condition of the Empire's strongest asset. He paused briefly, letting the implications settle. That is not coincidence. Valen's expression did not change, but the air around him grew colder. Then investigate, he said, his tone steady, unwavering. But he remains with me. The answer was immediate, leaving no room for negotiation. The man did not step back this time. If he is compromised, he said slowly, then so are you. The silence that followed sharpened instantly, tension coiling without release, and for a brief second, the hierarchy in the room felt uncertain. Valen did not raise his voice, did not shift his stance, but something in his presence changed, something heavier, more dangerous. Then prove it, he replied, calm, controlled, absolute. The man held his gaze for a moment longer, then exhaled softly, the tension easing by a fraction, not gone, only redirected. We are not here to remove him, he said finally, not yet. The last words were quiet, deliberate, and far more dangerous than anything else he had said. The king will see both of you, he continued. A direct evaluation, under royal authority. Valen did not answer immediately, his silence not hesitation, but calculation, the man added, before refusal could form. This is the compromise, he said. He remains under your proximity, and you present him together. Another pause. Then, more pointedly, unless you would prefer we proceed without it. The implication did not need to be stated. Valen understood it clearly. The choice was not freedom, Only control of the terms, and after a brief moment, he gave a single nod, small, controlled, but definitive. "We go together," he said, and that was the end of it. The decision settled not by agreement, but by necessity. The presence withdrew as quietly as it had arrived, leaving the room in a silence that felt heavier than before, and only when the doors closed did the pressure ease, just slightly. Valen remained still for a moment longer before his hand moved again, not to push Aaron away, but to confirm he was still there, still within reach. "Stay close," he said quietly, and this time, it was not an order. It was something else, something closer to certainty. Aaron stepped forward without hesitation, his hand lightly gripping the fabric at Valen's side. Grounding, steady, but his gaze lowered slightly. Something thoughtful, something uncertain flickering beneath the surface, the words he had heard echoing in his mind. Compromised, not what he appears to be. And for the first time, the question was not about where he came from, but whether his presence could become something dangerous, not to himself, but to the one standing in front of him and somewhere far beyond the reach of both of them. Preparations had already begun, not rushed, not chaotic, but precise, controlled, inevitable, because this was no longer a matter of curiosity, it was a matter of control, and whatever Aaron was, whatever he could become, the Empire would not leave it unanswered, and this time, they intended to see it for themselves. The journey to the royal palace was quieter than anything that had come before it, not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been said. The transport moved smoothly through secured corridors of airspace, every layer of defense parting without resistance, and inside, Aaron sat closer than usual, his fingers lightly gripping the edge of Valen's sleeve as if grounding himself, his gaze lowered, thoughts moving faster than his words could follow, until finally, he spoke, slow, careful. "I'm not what they think," his voice steady, but softer than before. Valen did not look at him immediately, but his hand shifted slightly, covering Aaron's without hesitation, firm, certain. "I know," he said, simple, without doubt, and that alone made Aaron look up, searching his expression as if trying to understand how something so absolute could exist. "They think I'm bad," Aaron continued, the words coming easier now, but heavier. "That I'll hurt you." The silence stretched for a moment, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. Valen's gaze finally turned to him, steady, unwavering. "If you were a threat," he said, "I would already know." The answer left no space for argument, no room for uncertainty, and something in Aaron's chest eased, just slightly. But the tension did not disappear completely. "I don't want to cause trouble for you," he said quietly. His fingers tightening just a little, Valen watched him for a second longer, then spoke, his tone lower, more deliberate than before. "You didn't," he said. "You didn't bring trouble." A brief pause. Then, more quietly, "You are the reason it stopped." Aaron blinked, the meaning settling slowly, and Valen continued, his voice still calm, but carrying something deeper now, something that did not belong to orders or strategy. "You are not a problem," he said. "You are the only thing that has ever worked." The words landed heavier than anything else he had said to him before, and for a moment, Aaron could not respond. Valen's gaze remained on him, steady, unshaken. "Whatever happens in there," he added, "you stay with me." And after a brief pause, he finished, "Nothing changes that." Aaron nodded, small, but certain, holding on to the words as if they were something solid, something real. By the time they arrived, the palace rose around them like something untouchable, vast, controlled, silent in a way that made even movement feel measured, every step guided, every glance accounted for, until they were led into a chamber that felt less like a room and more like a place where decisions were made and never undone. The king was already there, seated, still, his presence not overwhelming, but absolute. He did not speak immediately, did not acknowledge them in the way others would. Instead, his gaze settled directly on Aaron, sharp, assessing, and for the first time since entering, Aaron felt it, not fear, but pressure, as if every part of him was being read without permission. The king's expression shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, a faint crease forming between his brows, something like recognition, something unfinished, but it passed as quickly as it came. "Step forward," he said at last, his voice calm, controlled, leaving no room for refusal. Valen did not move. Not yet, his presence steady beside Aaron, but after a brief second, he allowed it, stepping forward with him rather than behind him, never breaking the distance between them. The questioning began without warning, precise, efficient, not aggressive, but thorough. Where he was found, what he remembered, how long he had been alone, why no system could identify him. Aaron answered as best as he could, slow but clear, his voice no longer breaking the way it once had, and the king listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving him, until finally he leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the arm of his seat. "I will need a separate evaluation," he said, not looking at Valen this time, but at the space between them, and that was when Valen spoke, calm, but absolute. "You can evaluate him," he said, "but not without me." The king's gaze shifted, meeting his for the first time, the silence between them sharp, measured. Then, after a moment, the king inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, but in acceptance of the condition. "Under your supervision," he said, and the test proceeded, controlled, contained, monitored at every level. The results came back as they had before, incomplete, inconclusive, no classification, no anomaly that could be proven, no evidence that could justify removal or containment, only absence, and in some ways, that was more unsettling than any confirmed threat. The king studied the final report in silence, then dismissed it with a small motion. "For now," he said, his voice unchanged, "he remains with you." His gaze flickered once more toward Aaron, sharper this time. "But under royal observation," he added. "Any deviation will be addressed immediately." Valen gave a short nod, not agreement, but acknowledgement, and that was enough. The audience ended there, clean, controlled, unresolved, and they were released without delay, the weight of the chamber lifting only slightly as they stepped out. But inside, the silence remained, and only when the doors closed did the king speak again, this time without formality, his voice lower, more thoughtful. "Did you see his eyes?" he said quietly. The guard beside him did not answer immediately, but the king continued, almost to himself, "They're familiar." A brief pause, his gaze distant now, as if reaching into something buried far deeper than the present moment. "Very familiar." His fingers tapped once, lightly, against the armrest, and then, softer, almost inaudible, just like hers. The shift began the moment they returned, not in any visible way, not in orders shouted across halls or alarms triggered through command channels, but in something quieter, something only those who had stood at the center of power long enough would recognize. Valen Cryos dismissed the outer personnel without explanation and convened a closed meeting with only those he trusted absolutely. The room sealed, communications restricted, every detail controlled. He did not waste time, did not circle. "The point." The king reacted. He said, his tone even, but precise. "Not to me." A brief pause. "To him." No one asked who. They all knew. The air tightened. "Something about Aaron doesn't align with what we've seen so far," Valen continued. "I want the origin point re-examined," he added, his gaze shifting toward one of his officers. "Everything tied to that abandoned sector, the wreckage, the signal logs, anything that was missed or erased." Another pause, sharper this time. "And keep it contained." His voice lowered slightly, more deliberate. "This does not reach the royal side." There was no hesitation in the room, only acknowledgement, the kind that came without question, because if Valen had seen something, then something was there, and they would find it, elsewhere, far above layers of protocol and silence. The king had already begun his own line of inquiry, quieter, deeper, pulling at threads that had long been buried, names without records, records without origin, a pattern that should not exist, and yet did, and while both sides moved forward, neither announced it, because this was no longer a matter to be shared, only to be uncovered. Aaron did not hear the orders, did not see the data, but he felt it, the shift, the subtle weight in the air, the way conversations paused just a fraction longer when he entered, the way glances lingered and then disappeared. It wasn't hostility, not yet, but it was distance, and that was enough. He stood near the window that evening, fingers resting lightly against the glass, watching a sky that felt too large, too unfamiliar, his chest tight in a way he could not name, and when Valen found him there, he did not ask what was wrong, because he already knew. The silence said enough. "Come with me," Valen said simply, And this time, it was not an order. It was something quieter, something meant only for him. They moved through corridors Aaron had never seen before, past access points that did not register on standard systems, deeper into a part of the structure that felt untouched by everything else, until the doors opened, and the world changed. The space beyond was not what Aaron expected, not steel, not structure, but something alive, a hidden expanse tucked within the fortress itself, where bioluminescent flora stretched across the ground like scattered constellations, soft light rising and falling in slow, breathing patterns, the air warmer, softer, carrying a quiet hum that felt almost like a heartbeat. Above them, a dome of transparent material revealed the night sky, but not the same one from before. This one deeper, clearer, untouched, as if it had been preserved only for this place. Aaron stopped at the threshold, his breath catching without sound, his eyes widening as the light reflected back at him. Brighter, softer, alive, he stepped forward slowly at first, then faster, drawn in without hesitation, the tension that had clung to him loosening with each step, replaced by something lighter, something almost childlike. He reached out, fingers brushing against the drifting glow of small winged creatures that moved like living sparks. Through the air, they scattered at his touch, then returned, curious, unafraid, and for the first time since they had left the palace, Aaron smiled without restraint, soft laughter escaping him as he followed their movement, forgetting for a moment everything else. Valen watched from where he stood, silent, still, the tension in his own shoulders easing just slightly. This place had always been his, a space no one else knew, a place he came to when the weight became too much, and now, for the first time, he had brought someone else into it. Aaron turned, stepping backward as he followed a cluster of light, his focus entirely on them, and his foot slipped against the edge of a smooth stone, the shift. Sudden, unbalanced. But before the fall could complete, Valen was already there, his hand firm at Aaron's waist, steadying him in a single motion, pulling him back into place. Too close now to ignore. The movement halted, the world around them quieting as if the space itself had slowed. Aaron's breath caught again, but this time for a different reason, his hands instinctively gripping Valen's coat, their eyes meeting at a distance that did not allow for avoidance. Not this time, not now. Something unspoken passed between them, something that had been building quietly from the moment they met, now impossible to ignore. Valen did not move immediately, as if giving Aaron time to step back, to refuse, but Aaron didn't. He stayed, his grip tightening just slightly, his gaze not breaking, and that was enough. Valen's hand shifted, gentler now, his thumb brushing briefly against Aaron's wrist, grounding, asking without words. And when Aaron didn't pull away, Valen leaned in, slow, controlled, giving him every chance to stop it. The first contact was light, almost hesitant, a brief press of lips that held more question than intent. But when Aaron didn't move, when he remained there, breathing uneven but steady, Valen deepened it, just slightly at first, then more, the restraint thinning, not gone, but tested, the space between them closing in a way that felt both new and inevitable. For someone who had long accepted solitude, who had measured his future in containment and decline, this should not have existed. This moment, this closeness, this quiet trust placed in him without demand or fear. And yet here it was, real, undeniable. The thought surfaced uninvited, sharp in its clarity. That everything he had prepared for, every outcome he had accepted, no longer aligned with the present, because now there was Aaron, small, fragile, but unyielding in the way he stayed, in the way he chose to remain close, in the way he reached for him without hesitation. And as the kiss slowly broke, not fully, just enough to breathe, Valen's forehead rested briefly against Aaron's, his voice low, quieter than it had ever been. "You shouldn't have found me," he said, not as a rejection, but as something closer to disbelief, something edged with something deeper, something he had not allowed himself before. And Aaron, still holding on to him, answered without thinking, without hesitation, "I'm glad I did." And in that moment, whatever balance had existed before shifted, not abruptly, not violently, but completely, because this was no longer just survival, no longer just necessity. It was something else now, something neither of them could step away from, even if they wanted to, and far Beyond the walls of that hidden place, the quiet investigations continued, lines crossing, data aligning, and somewhere within it all, a truth was beginning to surface, one that would not remain hidden for long. Morning came with quiet light filtering through the high windows, steady and calm, and this time Valen was already awake, not because of habit alone, but because he had not truly slept as deeply as before, his awareness lingering at the edge of rest, grounded by the presence beside him. Aaron was still there, closer than usual, his breath soft and even against Valen's shoulder, one hand resting lightly over Valen's chest as if he had drifted there without realizing. Valen did not move. Immediately, his gaze lowering to the small details he had begun to notice more often than he should. The way Aaron's expression softened in sleep, the way the tension he once carried had gradually disappeared, replaced by something warmer, something that had no place in the life Valen had planned for himself, and yet now existed without question, without permission. Aaron stirred slowly, his lashes trembling before his eyes opened. Confusion flickering for only a second before recognition followed. Then something else, something shy but unmistakably present. "Good morning," he said softly, the words still careful but no longer hesitant. Valen held his gaze for a brief moment, longer than necessary, then answered just as quietly, "Good morning." And for a second, neither of them moved, the space between them close enough that it carried the memory of the night before, not awkward, not uncertain, but new, unfamiliar in a way that neither of them had learned to define yet. Aaron shifted slightly, as if about to pull away, but didn't, his fingers tightening just a fraction against Valen's shirt. A silent question, a pause, and Valen understood it before it needed to be spoken. His hand rose, steady and controlled, resting lightly at the back of Aaron's neck, not pulling, not forcing, only guiding enough to close the distance. The kiss was soft at first, a quiet brush of lips that lingered just long enough to confirm it was real, not accidental, not a continuation of last night, but a choice made in the light of morning. Aaron stilled for a heartbeat, then leaned in just slightly, returning it, hesitant but sincere, and Valen felt it immediately. That small shift, that trust offered without defense. The kiss deepened only a little, not rushed, not consuming, but warmer, steadier, something that settled rather than ignited. And when it ended, neither of them stepped back right away, their foreheads nearly touching, breath close, unhurried. "We should get up," Valen said quietly. Though his hand did not move immediately, Aaron nodded, but his eyes lingered a moment longer before he finally pulled away, slower than necessary. The space between them returning, but not the same as before. Something had changed, something that would not reverse itself. The day resumed soon after, structured, precise, but softer at the edges in ways no one else could see. Aaron stayed close as always, though now it felt less like instinct and more like intention, his movements naturally aligning with Valen's, his presence no longer tentative, and Valen allowed it without question, adjusting nothing, correcting nothing, as if this had always been part of the pattern. During a break between reports, Aaron sat beside him with a book, reading quietly, his voice clearer than before, each word forming with growing confidence. Valen listened without looking, acknowledging only when Aaron paused. "Continue," he said, and Aaron did, the sound of his voice settling into the space between them, steady and grounding, until a faint shift passed through Valen's body, subtle, controlled, but noticeable. The early sign of imbalance returning, lighter than before, but present. Aaron reacted instantly, as if he had been waiting for it, setting the book aside and moving closer without hesitation, his hand finding Valen's sleeve, then his arm, then simply resting against him. The contact immediate, natural, and the effect followed just as quickly, the tension easing, smoother than before, faster, as if something between them had strengthened overnight. Valen registered it in silence. The difference undeniable now, not just proximity, but connection. He looked down at Aaron briefly, his expression unreadable to anyone else, but Aaron met his gaze without flinching. "Is it better?" he asked softly. Valen held his gaze for a moment, then answered, "Yes," and after a brief pause, added quietly, "Stay." Not an order this time, but something else entirely, and Aaron did, without hesitation, as if there had never been another choice, and far from the quiet of that moment, beyond the reach of warmth and trust, The investigation continued to unfold, lines connecting, fragments aligning, and in the shadow of it all, a truth moved closer to the surface, one that would not remain hidden for long. The corridor carried a softer rhythm that day, quieter in ways Aaron had begun to notice, as if something unseen had shifted beneath the surface of everything. He sat by the window with a book open in his hands, reading in a low voice, each word careful but steady, no longer breaking apart the way they once had. And though his eyes followed the lines, part of him remained elsewhere, always aware of where Valen was, always measuring that invisible distance that had come to matter more than anything else, until a familiar voice slipped easily into the space again, bright and unrestrained. "There you are," the woman said as she approached, hands loosely behind her back, her gaze already studying him before she stopped. "I was wondering when I'd find you alone," she added, then paused as if remembering something, a small smile forming. "Right, I never introduced myself," she said, tapping lightly against her chest. "Lyra Vance, Communications and Intelligence, and unofficially the most reliable source of information you're not supposed to hear." Aaron blinked, a little startled, then nodded quickly. "Aaron," he replied, his voice soft but clear. Lyra's smile widened just slightly. "I know," she said simply, her eyes scanning him again, sharper this time, catching the small details others might miss, the softened expression, the subtle warmth that hadn't been there before. "You look different," she said, more certain now, and before he could respond, she leaned in just a little, lowering her voice. "And don't try to tell me you don't know why." Aaron hesitated, fingers tightening around the edge of the book. "I don't." He tried, but the uncertainty betrayed him instantly. Lyra let out a quiet laugh, not mocking, just amused. "You do," she said, glancing briefly toward the command wing, then back at him. "It's in the way you keep looking over there," she added, "and in the way your whole face softens when you hear his name." Aaron's gaze dropped immediately, a faint warmth rising to his cheeks, confirming everything she needed. "Ah, Lyra," murmured, drawing the sound out with quiet satisfaction. "So something definitely happened." Aaron shook his head instinctively, but it lacked conviction. "No, I mean, it's not," he faltered, unable to finish, and Lyra's expression softened just slightly, though the curiosity remained. "Relax," she said, straightening. "I'm not here to interrogate you." Then, after a brief pause, her tone shifted, lighter on the surface but carrying something sharper underneath. "But you should know something," she added, lowering her voice again. "You picked a very interesting time to get close to him." Aaron looked up, confusion replacing embarrassment. "Why?" he asked quietly, and Lyra studied him for a moment, before answering, as if weighing how much to reveal, then sighed softly, giving in. "Because someone important is arriving today," she said, tone casual but precise. "A major family, old power, technically neutral, but very close to General Cryos's house," she continued, her gaze flicking briefly down the corridor before returning to him. "They don't move unless something big is coming," she added, letting that settle, then continued more quietly. "And they brought someone with them." Aaron's grip tightened again. "Someone," he repeated, and Lyra nodded. "An Omega," she said simply, then after a brief pause, added, "Male," her eyes watching him carefully now. "His name is Selim Arvis," she continued, placing each word with deliberate clarity. "If anyone was ever meant to stand beside Valen, it was him." The corridor seemed to fall into a deeper silence for a moment. Aaron went still, the book in his hands forgotten entirely. "They grew up together," Lyra went on, softer now, less teasing, more observant. "The family's intended for them to end up together," she added, then gave a small shrug. "Until Valen presented as 3S. The implication needed no explanation. No one can match that level," she said. "Not safely." Then after a brief pause, her gaze shifted slightly. "But feelings don't follow logic," she added, lowering her voice again, leaning just a little closer. "From what I've heard, Selim never stopped caring." Aaron's eyes lowered, something unfamiliar settling in his chest, heavier than before. "Does Valen?" he began, but the words didn't fully form, and Lyra watched him for a second before answering, more carefully this time. "Valen doesn't look back," she said, calm, certain. "But that doesn't mean others stop looking at him," she added, then tilted her head slightly, as if remembering one last detail. "Oh, and one more thing," she said quietly. He didn't leave. Her gaze held his this time. Sharper, he stayed. The meaning lingered between them, and before Aaron could respond, Lyra straightened slightly, her attention shifting as if sensing something approaching. "Looks like your general is on his way back," she said lightly, stepping back, her earlier ease slipping neatly into discipline again. "Try not to overthink it," she added, though her eyes suggested she knew exactly how impossible that would be, then turned to leave, but not before glancing back once more, her voice softer this time, almost an afterthought. "And if he's here, things won't stay simple." When she was gone, the silence returned, but it no longer felt the same, heavier now, filled with something Aaron didn't understand, only that it pressed somewhere deep in his chest, unfamiliar and difficult to name. And when Valen's presence approached, steady and unmistakable, Aaron didn't move toward him immediately this time, only looked up, a fraction slower than before, as if something had shifted, something small but real, something that quietly ached, even though he didn't yet know why. The arrival was announced without noise, but its presence carried weight long before anyone spoke. The corridor shifted subtly as personnel straightened, attention sharpening in a way that only happened when power entered a space. And when the doors opened, the difference was immediate. The man who stepped forward first carried the quiet authority of lineage, his bearing refined, controlled, the mark of a house that had stood unchallenged for generations, and beside him, just half a step behind yet impossible to overlook, stood Selim Arvis, everything about him precise, composed, and effortlessly striking, the kind of presence that did not demand attention yet held it completely, his posture straight but not rigid, his expression calm, almost gentle, but with a clarity in his gaze that spoke of careful upbringing and quiet certainty. The kind of Omega who had never needed to fight for his place because the world had always made space for him. Valen approached without hesitation, his stride measured, controlled, his presence grounding the space rather than yielding to it. "Lord Arvis," he acknowledged, his tone respectful but even. The older man inclined his head in return, the exchange brief, efficient, as expected between two figures of equal standing, and then, inevitably, Selim stepped forward, closing the distance with quiet confidence, his gaze settling on Valen in a way that was softer than anything he had shown the room so far. Familiar, almost relieved. "Valen," he said, his voice smooth, composed, but carrying something beneath it that had not faded with time. Valen met his gaze, unchanged. "Selim," he replied, no warmth added, but no distance either, simply recognition, the balance of something that had existed long before this moment. And then Selim's attention shifted, not abruptly, but deliberately, toward Aaron, who stood just slightly behind Valen. Within that now instinctive distance, his gaze moved over him slowly, assessing without appearing to, the faintest hint of curiosity passing through his expression before it settled back into calm politeness. "So," Selim said lightly, as if the topic carried no real weight, "I heard you finally found a way to manage your condition." His tone was smooth, almost conversational, but the implication was clear, and for a fraction of a second, the space tightened. Valen did not respond immediately, but instead moved, a small shift that changed everything, his hand reaching back without looking, drawing Aaron forward into clear view, not forceful, but deliberate, unmistakable. "This is Aaron," Valen said, his voice calm, steady. "He's not a solution." A brief pause. Then more clearly, "He's the reason I'm still here." The words landed without emphasis, but their meaning carried weight regardless. Selim's gaze remained on Aaron, unchanged for a moment longer, then necessary, then softened just slightly, a polite smile forming. "Then I owe you my thanks," he said, his tone gentle, refined. "You've done something no one else could," he continued, inclining his head just enough to acknowledge without lowering himself. "Valen is important to me," he added, almost as an afterthought, though the words were placed with care. "If there's anything you need, my family would be glad to provide it." The offer was generous on the surface, but beneath it carried a quiet assertion, something that did not go unnoticed. Valen did not react, his expression unchanged, his attention already shifting back to Lord Arvis. "We should begin," he said simply, indicating the direction of the command chamber. The older man nodded, following without further comment, and as they moved, Valen paused just briefly, turning slightly towards Selim. "If you need to rest, there's a guest suite prepared," he said. The words courteous, routine, but Selim shook his head lightly, a small smile returning. "I'd rather stay," he said, his gaze flicking once more toward Aaron. "It's been a long time," the meaning layered, not entirely directed at one person, and with that, Valen gave a short nod before continuing on, leaving the two of them behind. The silence that followed was quieter than before, but not empty. Selim turned fully toward Aaron now, the softness in his expression returning, though something sharper lingered beneath it. "You don't need to look so tense," he said gently, stepping just a little closer, his movements controlled, elegant. "I'm not here to make things difficult for you," he added, then paused, as if considering something, before continuing. "Valen used to dislike formalities," he said, his tone almost nostalgic. He'd avoid them whenever he could. A faint smile touched his lips. "He was easier then," he added, the implication quiet but present. Aaron listened without speaking, unsure where to place himself within the conversation, and Selim continued, his voice soft, measured. "We spent most of our time together when we were younger," he said, as if sharing something harmless. He would make time, no matter how busy he was. His gaze drifted slightly, not away from Aaron, but inward, recalling something personal. "He was attentive," he added, the word chosen carefully. "More than most would expect." The pause that followed stretched just enough to let the image settle, before he continued, lighter again. "Of course, that changed," he said, the softness fading just slightly. After his classification, the shift in tone was subtle, but unmistakable. "We were kept apart," he added, matter of fact, though something in his expression suggested it had not been simple to accept. "It wasn't safe." Another small pause, he made sure of that. His gaze flicked briefly toward the direction Valen had gone, then returned, steady. "Once more, there was an agreement," he continued, quieter now. "A future that was expected." The words careful, not bitter, but not without weight. "But it was put on hold," he finished, then allowed a faint, almost thoughtful smile to return. "Until now," he added, just lightly enough to seem like possibility rather than certainty. "Things are different," he said, his gaze settling on Aaron again, calm, composed, but searching. "With you here." The words were neutral on the surface, but something beneath them pressed just slightly deeper. "It changes things," he finished, and the silence that followed carried more than either of them acknowledged, because while Selim's tone remained gentle, polite, almost kind, the meaning behind his words was clear enough. This was not simply a meeting, and whatever had begun to form between Valen and Aaron, it was no longer untouched, no longer unquestioned, and it would not remain unchallenged. The war room did not allow for distraction, not with the weight of an approaching conflict pressing quietly against every decision. The projections hovered in midair, lines of movement, sectors marked in shifting light, and at the center of it stood Valen Cryos, his presence steady, grounded, the kind of control that did not need to be asserted to be felt. "Their advance pattern isn't random," he said, voice low, precise. "They're probing, testing our outer defenses before committing deeper." Lord Arvis stood across from him, composed, his gaze sharp as it followed the shifting map. "Then we prepare for escalation," he replied calmly, "and ensure they find no weakness to exploit." The exchange was efficient, seamless, two forces aligned not by trust, but by necessity and understanding. Adjustments were made, fleets repositioned, contingencies layered beneath contingencies until the structure held firm enough to withstand what was coming. When the projections dimmed and the discussion reached its natural end, the tension in the room did not dissipate. It settled, contained, ready to be carried into action. Lord Arvis turned slightly, his attention shifting to the one who had remained silent until now. "You wish to be involved," he said, his tone steady but not unkind. Selim stepped forward just enough to meet that expectation, posture straight, expression composed. "Yes," he answered, his voice smooth, controlled. "I've studied strategy, formations, command structures," he continued. "I want to participate in the operation." There was no hesitation, only quiet certainty. Lord Arvis regarded him for a brief moment before nodding once. Approval given without excess. Then his gaze shifted back to Valen. I trust you. Will ensure his safety, he said, the words formal, but carrying something deeper, something that spoke not only of duty but of expectation. Valen met his gaze without pause. He will be protected, he replied, direct, unwavering. And that was enough. The matter settled as they moved out of the war room, the corridor receiving them with a quieter tension, less structured but no less aware. Valen's attention moved instinctively, finding Aaron before anything else, and in that same moment, he noticed it, the difference, subtle but unmistakable, the slight hesitation, the absence of that natural closeness that had begun to define their presence together. Aaron, he called, and when Aaron approached, Valen reached out without thought, his arms settling across Aaron's shoulders in a gesture that was both casual and intentional, grounding, drawing him closer without question. Aaron stilled for just a fraction of a second before relaxing into it, and that was enough to anchor him again. Selim saw it, the movement small but clear, and something flickered across his expression before it was smoothed away, controlled, unreadable once more. Lord Arvis observed it as well, though he said nothing, only speaking again to Valen. I will leave him in your care, he said, and Valen inclined his head once. Acknowledgement without elaboration, arrangements followed swiftly, a suite prepared, access permissions granted, roles outlined with precision, nothing left uncertain, and soon after, the corridor began to empty, leaving behind only the quieter rhythm of movement that followed command. Valen resumed his pace, Aaron beside him, but the silence between them felt different now, heavier in a way that did not belong to comfort. Valen noticed it almost immediately, the way Aaron did not lean closer as he had before, the way his steps aligned, but did not close the space fully. Did he say something to you? Valen asked at last, his tone low, controlled. Aaron shook his head quickly. No, he said, though there was a slight pause before the words settled. Valen studied him briefly, then continued. Selim speaks carefully, he said, but he doesn't always consider how it sounds to others. His voice remained even, not defensive, but grounded in fact. He was raised differently, he added. His position allows him to overlook certain things. The explanation was simple, not meant to excuse, only to clarify. Aaron listened, then lowered his gaze slightly. He didn't do anything, he said softly. I'm just a little tired. The words were quiet, but something beneath them did not match the surface, and Valen recognized it. Though he chose not to press further, not yet, the day continued, but the pattern shifted in ways that became harder to ignore. Selim began to appear more frequently, always with purpose, always with reason that could not be dismissed outright. Questions about deployment, clarifications about command structure, requests for insight framed as necessity. His presence close, composed, never overstepping openly, but never distant either. And now that Valen's condition had stabilized further, his caution eased, his proximity no longer restrained by the same concern it once was. You still remember how I prefer these to be structured, don't you? Selim said lightly at one point, his tone soft, almost nostalgic, as he stepped closer to the console beside Valen, the familiarity in his voice quiet but unmistakable. Valen did not answer immediately, only adjusting the display. I remember what works, he replied, neutral, controlled. Selim smiled faintly, as if the response held more meaning than it revealed. Aaron stood a short distance away, watching, silent, his hands loosely at his sides, no longer stepping forward as instinctively as before, something in his chest tightening in a way he could not quite understand. Not pain, not quite, but enough to make him hesitate. Valen noticed that too, the shift subtle but real, and each time Selim closed the space more than necessary, Valen adjusted, not sharply, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough, a step to the side, a change in angle, and once, without looking, his hand reached back, finding Aaron's wrist and drawing him just slightly closer again. The movement brief, almost unnoticeable to anyone not watching closely, but enough to re-establish what had been disrupted. Selim's gaze flickered toward it for a fraction of a second before returning to neutral, the conversation continuing as if nothing had changed. The balance held, but not without tension. Hours passed in this quiet shift, nothing spoken directly, no confrontation allowed to surface, and yet everything felt different, as if the lines between them had been drawn without anyone acknowledging them aloud. And by the time the day began to settle, the difference could no longer be ignored, because, while nothing had been taken, nothing had been claimed openly, something had already begun to move, and for the first time, Aaron did not step closer on his own. Selim Arvis had never learned what it meant to be overlooked. From the moment he was born, the world had arranged itself around him, softened for him, shaped to accommodate his presence. And so there was something deeply unfamiliar, deeply unsettling, in the way things unfolded now, because no matter how often he appeared, no matter how carefully he chose his moments, Valen did not shift toward him the way he once had. Instead, it was always the same quiet pattern, Valen moving forward with that steady, unshakable rhythm, and Aaron at his side, not clinging, not demanding, but there, always there, close enough that the space between them no longer seemed like something that could be entered by anyone else. Selim watched it happen again and again, in corridors, in briefings, in the spaces between orders, Valen's presence instinctively aligning with Aaron's, his attention adjusting in small ways that most would miss. A hand resting lightly against Aaron's shoulder as they walked, a slight turn of his body to shield him from passing movement, the quiet habit of making sure Aaron remained within reach without ever needing to look, and every time, it tightened something inside Selim's chest in a way he refused to name. He had seen closeness before, had experienced it, had once been the one standing in that space, and yet now, he stood just outside of it, and it was not something he could accept easily, not when he knew, not when he remembered, not when he had been the one who was meant to stand there. The thought did not leave him. It sharpened, growing quieter, colder, more deliberate, and the frustration that followed did not remain contained for long. It surfaced in small ways at first, in the tone of his voice, in the way he addressed those around him, subtle shifts that most did not question. After all, he was Selim Arvis, son of a great house, someone whose presence alone carried authority, and yet, gradually, it became harder to ignore. "That's incorrect," he said sharply during one exchange, his gaze fixed on a junior officer who faltered under the weight of it. "If you can't even present a clear report, you shouldn't be standing here." The words were calm, but edged. The officer lowered his head immediately, apologizing, stepping back, and Selim turned away before the moment could linger, as if it had not mattered. But it did. The tension it left behind did not fade as easily. Whispers followed, quiet at first, then less so, especially when they drifted toward a subject that Selim could not ignore. "They really do suit each other," someone murmured once, unaware that he was close enough to hear. "The generals never looked at anyone like that before," another added, softer, and that was enough. Selim stopped, turning slowly, his gaze landing on them with a calm that was far more unsettling than anger. "If you have time to speculate," he said, his tone even, but cutting, "you have time to work." The room fell silent immediately, the conversation ending before it could begin again, and though no one challenged him, something had shifted, the air no longer as easy in his presence. And still, it was not enough, because no matter what he did, the center of it did not change. Valen remained the same, unmoved, and Aaron remained beside him, untouched by the pressure Selim tried to exert elsewhere, which only made it worse, because it meant the problem was not external. It was not something that could be corrected by control or influence. It was something far more difficult to dismantle, and that realization did not sit quietly within him. It pressed, slowly, steadily, until it began to take shape into something more deliberate, more intentional. But for now, he waited, watched, adjusted, looking for a way in, while across the corridor, in a quieter corner that felt briefly removed from the rest of the base, Aaron stood with Lyra once more, the familiar ease of her presence softening the edges of the day. "So," Lyra said, folding her arms loosely as she leaned against the wall, "you've noticed it too, right?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. Aaron hesitated, then nodded slightly. "He doesn't seem happy," he said carefully, unsure if that was the right way to describe it. Lyra let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. "That's one way to put it," she replied, then tilted her head, lowering her voice just a little. "He's not used to not getting what he wants," she added. "And right now, what he wants is standing next to you all the time." Aaron blinked, a little startled. I didn't, he began, but Lyra waved it off gently. You didn't do anything, she said, more seriously now. That's kind of the point, her gaze softened slightly as she looked at him. Listen, I've seen a lot of people around Valen, she continued. None of them get this close, not like you, she added. And he doesn't let them. Aaron looked down slightly, uncertain. He's just being kind, he said quietly, and Lyra shook her head, a faint smile returning. No, she said, firm but not unkind. Valen isn't kind like that, she added. He's precise, controlled. He doesn't give more than he means to. She paused, then met Aaron's gaze directly. If he treats you differently, it's because you are. The words settled more heavily than they sounded, and for a moment, Aaron didn't know how to respond, something warm and unfamiliar rising quietly in his chest, fragile, but real. He's only ever been like this with you, Lyra added, softer now. And it was that sentence, the last one, that lingered just a little too long, because it was also the only one Selim heard clearly when he stepped into the corridor at that exact moment, his movement silent, unnoticed until he was already close enough. Only with him? Selim repeated, his voice smooth, but carrying an edge that had not been there before. Lyra straightened immediately, her expression shifting back into something more formal. Lord Arvis, she acknowledged, but Selim's gaze remained fixed on her, the calm in it far more dangerous now. Working hours are not for idle conversation, he said, his tone controlled, but unmistakably displeased. If you have nothing to contribute, you should not be here. Lyra held his gaze, unflinching, but before she could respond, Aaron stepped forward, the movement small, but immediate. She's waiting to deliver documents, he said, his voice quiet, but clear. It's not personal. Selim's attention shifted to him slowly, the irritation in his expression sharpening just slightly. I wasn't addressing you, he replied, the politeness thinning. And yet you answered. The implication hung between them, heavier than before. If discipline is lacking, it should be corrected, he continued, his voice rising just enough to draw attention, not defended. The atmosphere tightened, the edges of the moment growing sharper, and for a second, it seemed like it might tip into something more, until another voice cut cleanly through it, steady, controlled, and unmistakable. That's enough, Valen said, stepping into the space, his presence grounding the tension instantly. His gaze moved between them once, assessing, understanding without needing explanation, then settled on Selim, internal. Discipline is handled by military command, he said, his tone even, but firm, not by guests. The word was chosen deliberately, and it landed. Selim held his gaze for a moment, something unreadable passing through his expression before it settled back into calm. I was only maintaining order, he replied, smooth once more, but Valen did not shift. Then allow us to do that, he said simply, the boundary clear, not aggressive, but unmovable. The silence that followed was brief, but decisive. Selim inclined his head slightly, the gesture controlled, conceding without acknowledging defeat. Of course, he said, stepping back just enough to restore the surface balance. Valen did not respond further, instead turning his attention immediately to Aaron. The shift in focus natural, unforced. Come with me, he said quietly, and, without waiting for a response, he reached out, guiding Aaron gently away from the corridor, away from the tension, into a quieter space just beyond, where the noise of the base softened into distance. Once they were alone, Valen's hand remained briefly against Aaron's shoulder before easing, his gaze lowering slightly. Did he upset you? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of command. Aaron shook his head quickly, though his eyes remained lowered. No, he said softly. I just didn't want her to get into trouble. Valen watched him for a moment longer. Then, without another word, his hand lifted, resting briefly against Aaron's hair, smoothing it back in a gesture so quiet it almost felt instinctive, before he leaned in slightly, pressing a light, steady kiss to Aaron's forehead, the contact brief, but grounding. You don't need to do that, he said softly. Not for anyone. And something in Aaron's chest eased at those words, just slightly, just enough, but not far from them. Just beyond the corner where the corridor turned, Selim stood, unseen, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the space they had disappeared into, the calm in his expression long gone now, replaced by something colder, sharper, something that had finally settled into decision, because whatever uncertainty had remained before was gone, replaced by clarity, by something far more dangerous than frustration, and this time, he did not turn away, did not step back, did not allow the moment to pass without meaning. Instead, his gaze lowered briefly, his hand tightening slightly at his side, and for the first time since his arrival, the thought in his mind was no longer reactive, no longer shaped by what he was seeing, but by what he would do next, slow, deliberate, inevitable. And when he finally moved, it was not toward them, but in the opposite direction, his steps quiet, controlled, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because somewhere between what he had lost and what he refused to accept, a plan had begun to take form, one that would not rely on chance, and one that would not leave room for anyone else to remain where they did not belong. To be continued.